Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and AP English, our World of Ideas lectures. We are in Unit 7, Faith, and we are in lecture number 42. This is the St. Teresa of Avila text, the Rapture of St. Teresa. Now this one's coming from the autobiography of St. Teresa of Avila from 1565. We're going to be working with the E. Allison Pierce translation of 1960. Now, we have already worked in unit number 7, Faith, with several of the sacred texts. Now, just to back up, in lecture number 3, at the very beginning of our World of Ideas lecture series, we were working with Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, which could have easily been put in this Unit 7 as well. Of course, we did the Buddha in Lecture 38. We did St. Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus Christ's teaching in Lecture 39. We did the Bhagavad Gita in Lecture 40. We did the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran in Lecture number 41. Now we're going to turn in the last 3 titles of Unit 7 to discussions of spiritual or religious experience. And in St. Teresa, we're going to be talking about metaphysical, mystical religious experiences, okay? And then we'll, in lectures 43 and 44 to follow, we'll talk with Nietzsche and with Martin Buber about notions of religious experience from a different perspective. Now, our assumptions, I've already mentioned LearnStrong now, LearnStrong.net. Our assumptions are that you've been following our lectures 1 through 41. Our assumptions are that you are aware of our learning theory, the desire to connect new information, told information in meaningful ways. We do that in our active reading annotation. Of course, by asking 3 guiding questions at level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? At level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? We'll also assume, hopefully, that you're reading this material on your own. Some of you will find this the most compelling reading of the entire Jacobus volume. I've had a number of students that have said that, just simply because they were kind of really blown away by what St. Teresa of Avila has to say about mystical experience. Since we're speaking about her, let's do some quick biography. Our dates, 1515 to 1582, born in Avila, Spain. She eloped to a Carmelite convent. She joins the church against her father's wishes initially, but ultimately supported. In 1538, she has this mysterious illness, leaves her in a coma for 3 days, and she will suffer a certain modicum of pain for the rest of her life. We have a lot to say about pain when we get to our Big 5 and the theodicy question in a bit. She's very, very controversial in her emphasis on prayer and meditation. She is canonized in 1622, even though she did have these mystical experiences and the like. By the way, because she dies in 1582, 1622, remarkably quick how fast she becomes canonized. I'm working now with Jacobus on page 630 with you. I'm just reading at the top of the page there. Among her many works is the book of her life, most of which was written in 1562 and was finished in 1565. The selection which appears here is chapter 29 from that book. All right. Writing this book, we should point out, Jacobus points out, entailed many dangers. While Teresa of Avila was writing, the Inquisition was at its height in Spain. The Inquisition claimed as its purpose rooting out the work of the devil in all its forms, and some of these forms involved diabolic seductions, especially of nuns. A respected nun with influence at court was arrested and imprisoned in 1532 for diabolical possession, and it was clear that one's aristocratic status would not guarantee protection if the Inquisition determined that the devil was at work. Consequently, Teresa's book was gone over very carefully by her confessors, and the manuscripts that still exist show corrections, exertions, excisions, changes in the handwriting of her confessors, who essentially acted as editors. The changes are not great or critical for the modern reader, but only after they were made was it possible for others to read her work. And then just to jump down a few more lines, The Writing of the Interior Castle, one of her most influential books, concerning the power of prayer began in 1577 after Teresa received a vision of the entire book and continued with interruptions until 1580. Like her other books, it was reviewed carefully by her directors and eventually published despite its sometimes unusual content. The selection that appears here, Teresa's visions of Jesus and the angels, right? She describes her visions very carefully in this chapter and in other chapters in her life, claiming that at first she was able to see only the hands of Jesus, then later his face, and then eventually his body. She emphasizes that she saw his human form as resurrected and that sometimes Jesus showed her his wounds. Sometimes Jesus appeared with a crown of thorns and sometimes bearing the cross. These visions naturally disturbed her confessors, some of whom were convinced that she was being beguiled by the devil. But other important church authorities listened closely to her and believed that the visions she had were divine and of great significance, right? Of course, she's going to emphasize her direct contact and experience with Jesus. Now let's spend a few seconds talking about the rhetoric to be, that is to say, the approach here, that's the compositional approach. I'm just reading Jacobus again. Authorities differ, right, in their assessments of Teresa's style and her rhetorical intentions. One recent translator sees her as a writer with relatively little skill, but with an immediacy and simplicity of style, and another sees her as unsophisticated and hasty. Some modern commentators, however, see her as a careful writer who knew her audience and knew how to communicate with both her male confessors and her female convent sisters. Teresa frequently complains that she is unworthy and that her writing skills are poor, but such expressions of humility are common in writing in the period. Those who knew her and watched her write marveled at the fact that she rarely paused or hesitated in her writing, and that she rarely, if ever, crossed out a word, almost as if somehow direct inspiration is happening, right? And then just to finish this rhetorical observation on 632, in earlier chapters, Teresa discussed the visions she had and the problems that are associated with them, including the fear that the visions might have been sent to her from the devil. She explains that she thought of such a possibility right away, but that it is impossible. Later, she explains how her confessors taught her to confront the vision of Jesus to discover whether it's a devilish fraud. When she reveals her conflicted emotions as she snaps her fingers at Jesus, we understand how she feels even though we have never had her visions. She is able to help us understand even the most unintelligible of human experiences by virtue of her directness and simplicity. And obviously, reading this pushes our ability of credulity as well, right? But hello, that's why the unit's called faith, right, after all. Teresa's simplicity and directness reveal the depth of her faith in the goodness of the visions she's received. She has such intense belief in Jesus that she believes she is in his presence, much the way Arjuna, for example, is in the presence of Lord Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, or we might say much the same way that, for example, the Prophet Muhammad will believe that Gabriel is giving him important information, right, from our earlier lectures. To finish now, her faith is in her union with God, and the raptures that are associated with this faith are clearly communicated in this selection. Now, let's go to work with it now at level 1, outlining and paragraph outlining. What does the text say? Paragraph 1. Teresa says, we may create in imagination an image of Christ, but the kind of visions described here are not products of the imagination, but revelations from the Lord. Paragraphs 2, 3, my visions were not within my control. It was not a matter of wanting or not wanting them. They came through an effort of my own. They came through no effort of my own. Excuse me. Paragraph 4, the Lord appeared to me, she says, in his glorified bodily form. Many who heard of my visions said that I was possessed by the devil. This didn't trouble me, for I regarded the visions as a great favor from the Lord. Paragraph 5, one of my confessors, thinking that I was deceived, ordered me to resist the visions. I obeyed reluctantly, even though I continued to regard the visions as a favor from God. Paragraph 6, in resisting the visions, I felt I was rejecting the Lord. I asked him to forgive me, and he offered comfort and reassurance. Paragraph 7, now we'll talk about some of these visions. In one vision, the Lord transformed the wooden cross of my rosary into 4 precious stones. The more I tried to resist my visions, the more often they came. It was not in my power to cease thinking of the Lord. He told me how to answer my critics. Paragraph 8, later the Lord, His Majesty, gave even clearer signs of his presence. I was overpowered with violent love and longing for him, and regarded death as the only way to fulfill my longing. Paragraph 9. My impulses were not simply the kind of religious feeling that can be controlled by reason. Such feelings, like those of a sobbing child, should not be allowed to boil over, but must be soothed and turned into inward reflection. Paragraph 10. My impulses were of a different, more powerful kind. Rather than coming from within, they were thrust on me like arrows driven into my entrails and heart. This indescribable wounding by God was enormously painful and distressing, and at the same time, deeply satisfying. We think of the stigmata of St. Francis of Assisi as a counterexample to some of this, or a continued example, right? In this state, she says, the soul would gladly die for the love of God. Paragraph 11. My distress and bliss overwhelmed me. God's love sparked in my soul a fire of unbearable longing. Paragraph 12. At times my pain abated. At other times my impulses were so strong that they paralyzed me spiritually and physically. We think of Joyce in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and his exchange with the priest there. And then, of course, some of the descriptions of the powerful feelings in his epiphany that he has. Some of this will sound similar. Of course, that lecture available at learnstrong.net as well. Paragraph 13. On rare occasions, she says, I had a vision of an angel who pierced my heart with a golden spear. This experience, which was both painful and sweet, left me aflame with the love of God. Paragraph 14. During my raptures, I walked about in a stupor and clung to my pain and bliss. I'm grateful to the Lord, she says, for transporting my soul and sending me these ecstasies. Well, as you read this material, of course, we have to deal with it at level 2 and 3. Obviously, this is going to be for us now the question of our big 5. Let's begin with epistemology, what one can know. Well, it's interesting because the way she presents this information is not so absolutist in its epistemological rendering. It's certainly not relativist either, although she does have her doubts at times. It's what we will argue fallibilist. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. She's not always confident and sure of these raptures until, of course, later on when she begins to realize she believes that these are, of course, visions from God. Ontologically, what is it that this text says about who we are? Well, I would say it's fairly self-evident. Humans are capable of some pretty complex kinds of experiences, right? And, of course, these complex experiences prove, for Avila anyway, that we are children of God. Psychologically, what's this text say? Fear is a powerful and useful tool, no doubt. Sociological, well, obviously, the need to show respect to those we don't understand. In a very almost clandestine way, she's saying to her confessors, you need to appreciate the fact that not all of us have the same experiences of the divine. And then finally, theodicy and pain and suffering. What is it that's being said here? Well, you can hear it. The pain is the bliss, right? Pain and suffering is valuable. It's a propedeutic. Often we've said it as, why is this happening for me, not why is this happening to me, right? At 2A messages, pain obviously is a great teacher. And another possible message here is that faith is important, and it does require patience. An understanding that patience is the long road, if you will. At 2B, well, this is some very simple and direct language, no question about it. And the descriptors for many of my students are just powerful. It's like, whoa, you get the sense she's not actually making this up. I mean, you may argue she's deluded, but whatever she is, she's pretty convinced it happened, right? At 3A, we can ask this question, of course, about religious and mystical kinds of experiences. What about our reading of the Tao Te Ching, or the Buddha, or Matthew, or the Gita, or even the Quran, is somehow going to help to inform our reading here, or vice versa? Think about it, for example. We said in our study of the Quran that Muhammad is in the cave and he's receiving this information right through the angel Gabriel, a mystical kind of insight. Of course, we can mention Houston Smith here. I'll also mention a thinker that so many of you are commenting about now in Jordan Peterson. He talks a lot in his Genesis lectures about religious experience, and he argues as a neurologist and as a psychologist that religious experience is in fact a scientific fact. We have absolute knowledge now and certainty on this fact that it is something that does happen, right? And can be induced, of course, in a number of ways. And then finally at 3B, oh, how are you going to respond to a reading like this? I mean, it's unusual reading, right? Far different than almost any of the other readings in the Jacobus volume. What was a time that you did have a very, very strong, almost like, if you want, out-of-body experience? And finally, do you believe in this idea of religious experiences as informative? Well, I'll leave it to you, and you can make some decisions one way or the other. Thank you.